Hi everybody, it's Matt Thorburn coming to you from New Jersey. Looks like people are just joining. This is very exciting. It's the first time for me doing one of these online readings. I've done a lot of readings in person, but I've never done this before, so this is very exciting. Glad to be part of the LSU Press reading series online. If you're there, if you can hear me okay, give a thumbs up if you would. Hi, Elisa. Hi, Jeff. Great to see some names I know, some friends online. One of the great things about this series to me is that I get to read for people who live places where I probably never would have done a reading otherwise. I'm not someone who can go on a big book tour like most poets, so it's really exciting to get to share my work with people all over the country and maybe even beyond that. Hey, Michelle. Hey, LB. This is a chance for me to read to you from my book, The Grace of Distance, which is right here. And this is the second book that I've been fortunate to publish with LSU Press. My first book with the press was Dear Almost. This was published in 2016. It's a book-length poem, and it won the Lascaux Prize for collected poetry. And then just back in the fall, it seems like a long time ago, but just a few months ago, really, I published The Grace of Distance with LSU Press. And this book was recently named a finalist for the Patterson Poetry Prize, which was really exciting for me. Hey, Michael. Hey, Mari. Christine. Nice to see you guys. I want to say a quick but very big thank you to LB Kovac at LSU Press, who was running this series and was very kind to walk me through how this works. Since, like I said, I've never done this before, and she made it very easy, and it seems to be going very smoothly, so I'm relieved. I also want to thank my series editor, Ava Heyman, who worked very closely with me on both of these books and has been just an amazing person to work with, and also my editor, Neil Novak, who likewise has shepherded my work through the whole publication process for both of these books. And there are two people I'm just super grateful to get to work with, as well as the designer, Michelle Newstrom, who created both of these beautiful covers and all the pages inside, and made my work just look really, really nice. So I'm going to read a few poems from The Grace of Distance, and then we're going to do a little Q&A if you want to send any questions through in the chat box. That would be great. I'll read those at the end and try to respond to them. When I was thinking about what to read, it sort of struck me that some of these poems, this is a book about distances, which of course is a word that means something different now than it did when I wrote these poems. But it's about the distances between people, between family members and loved ones, between parents and children, also the distances between cultures, geographical places, distances, in memory and imagination, and even the distances, between things like faith and doubt. And now, of course, distance means something much more even immediate and physical, I suppose. But so I thought I'd read a couple of poems that are kind of about, for me, what life used to be like. They're poems about New York City, where I lived for a long time, and where I used to go to work every day. I work from home now. I'm lucky to still be working, but doing it remotely. But I used to be in the city 4 days a week, and I love New York City very much. So I wanted to read a couple of poems about New York City, and then a couple that are about some of those kinds of distance. So this first poem is a little short poem. It's actually the last poem in the book. I'm going to read it first. And this is dedicated to my friend and one of my first poetry teachers, an amazing poet named Keith Taylor. And if you don't know his work, you should definitely get your hands on some of his books to read as soon as you can. This is called Watch Over Us. And this is about an experience in New York City and about one of Keith's books. Watch Over Us. Keith, it seemed only right, reading your marginalia for a natural history on the hot subway home from work, to turn the page. The pages are loose, the book well thumbed, and find a mosquito poised at the top of the next one. Delicate as a watch spring, its body a tiny, shiny transistor. I thought I'd smush it with my thumb, but then how did it get there? Where could it be headed? Traveling uptown like me. Lord, watch over us all tonight on these journeys we may not even know we're taking. was sort of deep nostalgia for the New York City subway these days, which is not something I thought I would have felt when I used to actually write it every day. And this is one more poem about the city and about Manhattan in particular. And this poem started with an anthology of poems about perfumes that my friends Jean Dubrow and Lindsay Lusby edited some years ago. And they sent little vials of perfume to a bunch of different poets to respond to and write a poem about in whatever way that sort of it spoke to them. And I got one called Manhattan, which seemed very appropriate. I'm not a perfume person or a cologne person really, but it just struck me that this probably smelled like some of the people in Manhattan, and I'm sure people there were wearing this, but it didn't smell like the things that I love about the city, really at all. And so that's kind of how I responded. So this poem is titled with a question. It's called, "This is What the City Smells Like?" And it's after the fragrance Manhattan by Bond No. 9. This is what the city smells like? No, give me the steam of pork dumplings, 10,000 made by hand each day on Mott Street. The cool marble of Grand Central, where 250,000 people catch a train. Shoe polish and subway ad glue, and a pale dusting from the rising sun of pizza dough spinning overhead. Mix for me the horsey funk of handsome cabs, yellow mustard on a hot Knish, on again, off again rain, a dash of asphalt and taxi exhaust, the sawdust and cement dust of buildings going up or coming down. Give me a gust of hot bakery air, the sweet and sour tang of a rush hour train, newsprint and armpits, damp wool, baby powder, a hint of hope or disappointment, depending on the hour. For me, it's the dark tickle of luncheonette coffee. It's briny pickles plucked from a barrel and the gingery waft of a midtown sushi den. Give me 59th Street fountain spray, faint and cool on the breeze. From that 100-year-old fountain, homeless men sneeze and dip their toes in. And even a whiff of the glossy black bags piled high along 35th. Trash shining and baking in the morning sun. But Corsican immortelle, gold saffron and sandalwood, notes of suede? Take a hike up Fifth Avenue and spritz some other guy with that. Anoint my neck and cheeks with espresso dust and the grease of this pig floating past, roasted red and glistening, shouldered high on a board by 2 skinny cooks bickering in Cantonese and pushing through the crowd on Canal Street. Let us sniff matzaripas, disco fries, decades of spilled beer behind the piano at the Vanguard, and the ghost of cigarette smoke in all the bars you can no longer smoke in. This city smells like milk crates full of foxed paperbacks for sale on the sidewalk, like the fishmonger in her gut-mapped apron, fish scales glittering on her wrists. It carries the zing of pickled herring. It smells like glazed donuts and nail polish, yellow curry, a stack of scratch-off tickets, and a dirty penny. Like bodega roses, kimchi, and fried rice, and the faraway ocean you can sometimes smell deep in downtown, if just for a moment you stand perfectly still. Take a little sip of water. So then I also want to read a couple of other poems, a couple of shorter poems that are about distances. And this is the first poem in the book. And I was thinking, as I was looking at these again yesterday, that some poems, like the first poem I read and this poem, have very clear beginnings for me as a writer, what got me started writing, what I wanted to write about. Definitely as you're writing, or as I'm writing, the intention that I start with may well change as something totally different. But this poem is a little more mysterious to me. It kind of came out of reading classical Chinese poetry, and particularly in reading some of the translator's notes to some poems that I was reading. And I sort of had this story occur to me, and that's what this poem is about. It's called The Call. Once a boy slipped down a well in far Anhui. He surfaced deep in Mongolia, whispering through his fever of the vast, star-clouded sky he swam beneath. Once I called down into that dark glitter, then cursed, then bargained, then begged, until someone called back. And then I'm going to end with just two more poems. These are both poems that I don't write a lot of formal poetry really at all, but sometimes there'll be a little challenge I want to give myself, or a little formal constraint to work against. Sort of the way if you're writing a sonnet, having only 14 lines makes you, get to the point and say what you need to say pretty quickly. I thought it'd be interesting to try to write a poem that was all one sentence. And so each of these last two poems do that. This one is fairly short, and it's called The Other Side. In the old ink and brush style of painting, the brush can't leave the paper until you're done, so that it's all one long line that turns and loops back, taking its time. And sometimes standing here outside the door as snow filters across the blue-black sky, and I can hear you on the other side. I can't remember if I've only just arrived or it's time for me to go. And I'm going to end with one other poem that is a little bit longer. This is also sort of in one long run-on sentence. This poem is about a few musicians at a recording session, and it's sort of the end of the session, and they're sort of all done and get ready to go, and then the way people will, somebody has one more thing to say or one more thing to play, and kind of what happens after that. So this is called How Every Song Ends. I guess the tune was out of nowhere, and so it must have been a lark, a laugh, since the session was already over. The bass in its case and the piano lid lowered. Everyone headed out the door for a pre-dawn drink or a bad girl's arms. And don't forget to kill the lights. But then Joe strums his guitar, picks out those opening notes, and the trumpets, one older, fainter, one bright and brusque, step up to tell us what this song's all about. That timeless back and forth, what she said and he said, nudging each other, disagreeing and agreeing about who was right, who was wrong, who did or didn't do what, noodling through all the should-haves and meant-tos that make up our lives, the laundry list of missed calls, closed doors, the letter unsent, that time he didn't look back but wishes he did. And don't you know it's late, too late, that's what the trumpets call out. And yet, how happy the end of this night caught on tape. How lucky the engineer who flipped the switch, turned the lights back up so he could see the trumpets' bells, the guitar's dull glow, Doc and Bud and Joe. How this whirl of notes circles the mic. And how we who weren't even alive for these 6.5 minutes, not long, long enough, long ago, hold our breath as here they come now, all the way around, to play the chorus once more and remind us how every song ends by going back to where it began, until there's only silence and someone stops the tape, turns out the light. So those are a few poems from The Grace of Distance, and I'm excited to get to share those with you. And I'm going to see if there's some questions here. I'll try to respond to those. I didn't see everybody who joined while I was talking. This is great. Hi, Stephanie. Hi, Lisa. Hey, Jason. Let me see here. I'm not very good at scrolling and reading and talking all at once. Hey, Maxine. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm scrolling through here again. Okay, here's a question. do you think of yourself as a place-based poet? And I think my answer to that is yes, or at least I write a lot about places. What I've discovered, I haven't lived in a lot of places, but I grew up in Michigan, and then I lived in New York City for about almost 20 years, and I've lived in New Jersey for a couple of years. And what I've noticed is that there's a little bit of a lag for me, and oftentimes wherever I'm living, I'm sort of writing about the place before that, sort of looking back the way people do. So I wrote some about New Jersey, or about New York when I lived there, and sort of still write about it. And then a number of poems in this book are set in China, or have to do with Chinese poetry or Chinese culture, which I haven't gotten to live in China, but I've been able to visit twice, and so that's sort of looking back on those experiences in those poems. So thank you for that question. There's a let's see, I guess if anybody else has a question, they can send those in. Maybe I'll just read one more poem since we've got a little bit of time. Let's see. There's this is a poem. This is a little poem which has to do with Chinese poetry, and it's actually in response to another poem. There's a classical Chinese poet named Wang Wei, and I read a lot of his poems in this book. This is the old Penguin Classics edition, and he has a little short poem that I liked. It's only 4 lines, and the speaker says to someone, he says, "You just came from my old village, so you must know all about village affairs. That winter plum tree by her curtained window, tell me, was it flowering when you left?" And I just thought it's a really interesting little poem that in just 4 lines sort of suggests relationships and connections and things. I thought it was very interesting how the speaker asks about this tree as sort of a way of asking about this person. And so I wrote a little poem in response to that. It's called Plum Blossoms. I'll just read this and then take another question. It must have been late January or February, and he doesn't even say what color the petals would be. White or rose or deep red. Cold there, though not so cold as here. It might mean he misses her, the way he misses that tree because he misses her. Sometimes you can only ask the question beside the question you want to ask. If the curtains were parted, you might have seen her arm, the one that's a shade darker, even in winter, from sitting in the same chair, in the same spot, with the same book, each day beside her window, waiting for what? It's a small window with faded curtains set, she often thought, too low, that frames a branch and sometimes a bird, and lets a yellow square of light land on the table like a placemat, where her arm rests as she reads or doesn't read, sips tea or drifts away and lets her cup grow cold. He doesn't ask if she has grown old, because they both have. Perhaps white strands run through her black hair and catch the light, just so. One branch is enough if it's gnarled and dark, if it elbows out and hangs low with plum blossoms. So that's just one more poem I want to share. Here's a question. Let me see. How was the writing process of this book different from your last book, Dear Almost, which is a single poem? And did you feel you had more freedom to explore? That's a great question. It's interesting because I actually wrote a lot of the poems in The Grace of Distance and a lot of this book-length poem, Dear Almost, in the same time period. As I was working on the book-length poem, sometimes ideas would come up or things would occur to me for a poem that definitely wasn't part of that project, but that was sort of a poem of its own, a shorter poem. And so I would work on those as well. And the other thing I would say about this book is there's sort of a number of the poems in it, sort of the heart of the book, as I think of it, are poems I wrote over actually quite a long period of time, going back to my first book. And as I put together my first a couple of books, there would be poems that, for reasons of theme or subject or style, just didn't quite fit in those books. But there were poems that I liked, and I saved those in a folder, which over time got a little bit thicker and a little bit thicker. And at a certain point, I looked through there and I felt like there was the beginnings of a book there of these poems that hadn't fit into other books. Just a handful of poems, but they started to suggest some themes, some of these ideas about distance. And I realized that why they didn't fit in those other books was because all of these, in fact, were about distances of different kinds, as mentioned at the beginning. And so that kind of gave me a direction to then keep writing with more of an idea of what a book might be about, and write a lot more poems that became this book over time. So it was a very different experience. With the book-length poem, one of the things I liked was just being in it for a long time. The novelist Richard Ford talks about his favorite part of writing a novel is when he's just in the middle of it, and he says he can't feel either end or the sides. He's just sort of floating through it and living in that world. And that's definitely how I felt with the book-length poem, which I worked on for several years and just sort of lived with and worked on, and I carried it with me to work every day in my bag, and I'd look at it on the subway, because I lived in New York at the time, and the subway ride to and from work, and look at it at lunchtime and just sort of carry a copy of it with me to work on. And that was a really unique experience for me. Here's a question from Harvey. Hey, Harvey, about process. Are you an inveterate list and note keeper? Lines you could mine for later poems as appropriate? A little bit, not as much as I used to be. For years and years, I was a huge notebook writer. I filled up a lot of notebooks and carried them with me, or had them at home and wrote in them. And I still do. I do less of that, but that's sort of how I started. A lot of notebook writing. I think also when I was younger, I did that more because I would work on more different poems at a time. Whereas now, for whatever reason, I feel like I sort of work much more like one poem at a time. So I do less of that. But still, there'll be times when I come to a point where I just sort of look through a notebook, see what's there. And sometimes you'll find two different things in the notebook that sort of talk to each other in a way that is surprising. And that's sometimes how a poem starts for me. Hey, Nancy. Glad you're here. Hey, Valerie. There's one poem, I don't have time to read it today, but there's one poem in this book, if you have it and want to check it out, In Grace of Distance. There's one poem that is called, I want to make sure I say this right, Like Hours of Rain on Piles of Brown Leaves. And that's actually a poem that came out of jotting down in a notebook. And I had this very serendipitous experience, which I don't think has ever happened since then, or it happened before, but I was reading through an old notebook, and there were about 6 or 8 things over the course of maybe 6 or 8 pages that all sort of spoke to each other in a way that I had written them all down at different times, but they sort of connected. And so it's a poem that makes these sort of associational leaps, but it was definitely a product of that sort of just being attentive and writing things down when you have the chance. So I'm just going to scroll back up if I missed anything here. Thanks so much for all the comments, and thank you all for joining us. This is, I wish I could see you. That's the thing I miss about live poetry readings, but I have to say this is a wonderful group of friends and family and people I know who I could never get in the same place in real life or in person. So it's wonderful to be here together on screen. So many good comments. I'm going to have to read these more later. Here's a question from Pia. Hey, Pia. She asks, now that these 2 books are done, do you feel yourself moving in another direction in your writing? I am, or maybe I should say that I did already. I'm someone who, at least for the last number of years, I've been sort of writing, in some ways writing sort of one book ahead of what I've published, and sort of working on the next thing. And so I'd actually, when The Grace of Distance was published, I'd written what I think are all of the poems, or most of the poems, for a new collection. I'm still sort of figuring out how they fit together, and if it is a whole collection or if there's more to it. But after writing a book-length poem, I had the urge to write shorter poems and write about more various things. And that's kind of how The Grace of Distance, the more recent poems in that book, sort of written out of that feeling. And then after writing these two books, and particularly after writing Dear Almost, which is very personal and autobiographical, I felt like I wanted to write something that was really just a work of imagination and had nothing to do with my life, and would be sort of my way of writing fiction, if you will, although in lyric poems. And I was reading the French poet, Jean Fallin, and that was sort of where this all started. But I had this sort of idea of a story of a boy living in a time of war, or sort of the before and after of the war, and just sort of losing everything and going through this horrible experience, and what that would be like, and what his view of things would be like, and how he would survive that. And I thought, this has nothing to do with my life. I have not experienced that, thank God. And it would be this sort of escape as a writer. And then as I was writing, I realized, well, what he loses are his family and his friends. And it became a book or a series of poems about fathers and sons, and mothers and sons, and friends and aunts and uncles, and what those relationships mean, and what it would be like to lose people. I haven't lost people in the war, but certainly, people I love have passed away, or just to be far from people. And as I was writing this, then I realized, of course, this isn't a work of fiction. All those things are things that I feel. And writing about fathers and sons, I'm a son and a father. It's right in my wheelhouse. So you can't really escape writing about yourself, I guess. But anyway, that's what I'm working on now, which I think is very different from the work that I read today. Those are poems that are mostly without punctuation, which, going back to the idea of having sort of a formal constraint, that's something that I never used to really like in other people's work. I'll say, as I was reading it, I'd be sort of frustrated by that, to the point that I thought, well, I should try this. Is there a way I can do this that I would like? That's also kind of how that started. We're just about out of time. Unless if there's one more question here. There's a question from Eric. Hey, Eric. He wants to know if you feel there are any character traits or virtues that facilitate the poetic process, or to put it differently, what sort of traits do you most try to cultivate in yourself or students that you admire in other poets? Are there core traits of the poet? I think paying attention is probably the biggest thing, and if it's writing it down in a notebook or just keeping it in your mind, but just sort of being attentive to what happens. The Irish poet Seamus Heaney wrote about and talked about the music of what happens, and I think that's kind of at the core of it, and that can mean being attentive to the sound of a particular phrase, hearing the sound of a word you like, but also just sort of being aware of your own feelings and thoughts. I think that might find themselves in their way into a poem. Like I was saying, when I was younger, I wrote everything down in a notebook because I was afraid I would forget it. And that's probably good practice because I do forget a lot of things. But I've also found as I get older that the things that end up in poems for me, I do still write them down, but I think the things that really are moving and that are really going to become a poem, I do just remember them. They stay with you, or they'll come back to you later when it's time. So I think paying attention. The other thing I would say is just being determined and diligent. I think it's like a lot of things, it's something you have to do just for yourself, and want to do. I'm very fortunate to get published with LSU Press, but there are a lot of wonderful poets who aren't published, who have a book manuscript they're sending out. So there's not, that isn't really tied into the artistic talent necessarily, unfortunately. So I think just being determined and staying with it and writing because you love writing and being in the middle of it is really what's going to keep you going. So I think I'm going to end on that note. I want to say thank you again. Hey, Julie, thank you again so much, everybody, for being here, for being part of this, and it's a wonderful experience. Wonderful to be with you all. I get to share these poems. So thank you so much. Take care. Be safe and be well. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.